The church basement smelled like folding tables and reheated coffee, which was exactly what Lionel Beaumont had expected when his daughter talked him into coming. He hadn't wanted to. He'd said so 3 times on the drive over, and once more in the parking lot, standing in the November cold with his hands in his coat pockets while a Daisy locked the car and pretended not to hear him. She had his stubbornness, which meant arguing with her was like arguing with himself, and he'd learned years ago that he almost always lost those arguments too. "It's a community dinner," she'd said, "not a blind date. Nobody's going to make you do anything." He'd nodded because nodding was easier than explaining that the problem wasn't being made to do anything. The problem was walking into a room full of strangers at 53 and having absolutely nothing to say. Maplewood United Church had been running their monthly community dinner for 11 years, according to the laminated sign taped to the basement door. Lionel read it twice while Ade signed them in at the welcome table. The woman behind the table had a name tag that said volunteer, Ruth, and she smiled at him the way people smile at someone who looks like they might bolt. "First time?" she asked. "That obvious?" "You're standing like you're waiting for a bus," Ruth said, not unkindly. "Give it 20 minutes. The food helps." The room held maybe 60 people, long tables covered in paper tablecloths, the kind that came on rolls, mismatched chairs, a folding stage at the far end where a teenager was setting up a microphone that nobody would end up using. The overhead lights were the fluorescent kind that made everyone look slightly tired, which Lionel supposed was honest. A Daisy steered him toward a table near the middle, which was also the worst possible location, because it meant strangers on every side and no wall to put his back against. He sat down anyway. She disappeared to get food from the buffet line and left him there with a paper cup of water, and the particular loneliness of a man surrounded by people having conversations he wasn't part of. He hadn't always been this way. There had been a version of Lionel Beaumont who was easy in a room, who remembered names and asked good follow-up questions, and made people feel like they were the most interesting person he'd spoken to all week. Morel used to say he could charm the leaves off a tree. He'd laughed the first time she said it. He'd laughed a lot of things off back then. Murray had been gone for 6 years. Pancreatic cancer, which was the kind of diagnosis that didn't give you much time to argue with it. 14 months from the first symptom to the last morning. He'd held her hand through all of it, and then he'd driven home from the hospital alone and sat in the driveway for 2 hours without going inside, because inside was where her reading glasses were still on the nightstand and her handwriting was still on the grocery list on the fridge. He'd eventually gone in. He'd eventually learned to move around the house without bracing himself, but eventually had taken most of those 6 years, and somewhere in the middle of it he'd lost whatever it was that used to make him easy in a room. A Daisy came back with 2 plates. She set one in front of him, roast chicken, scalloped potatoes, green beans that had been cooked the way his mother used to cook them, which is to say thoroughly and without apology. He picked up his fork. "You're doing the thing," Adeze said. "What thing?" "The thing where you look at your food like it's a task you have to complete." He looked up. She was watching him with the particular expression she'd inherited from Murray, the one that was equal parts exasperation and affection, and it was the kind of thing that could still catch him sideways if he wasn't careful. "I'm eating," he said. "You're enduring," she said. "There's a difference." He almost said something about how he was 53 years old and didn't need his daughter coaching him on how to exist at a dinner table. But the words felt too much like something a person says right before they prove the coaching was necessary. So he took a bite of the chicken instead, which was good, actually. Seasoned properly, not dried out, and said nothing. The table filled in around them. A retired postal worker named Gordon who had strong opinions about the senator's defensive lineup. 2 sisters from Kanata who'd been coming to these dinners since their mother passed. A young couple, maybe mid-20s, who held hands under the table and spoke mostly to each other in a way that made Lionel think of being that age, which felt very far away. He was doing all right. Present, if not exactly comfortable. He'd almost stopped watching the clock when the chair across from him, the one that had been empty since they sat down, got pulled out. The woman who sat down didn't make a production of it. She set her plate down first, then her water, then herself, arranging things with the careful economy of someone who'd learned to take up exactly the space she needed and no more. She had gray-streaked hair cut short and practical, a dark green sweater, and the look of someone who had somewhere else to be and had decided to be here anyway. She glanced around the table once, caught Lionel looking, and gave him the brief, neutral nod of someone acknowledging a fellow human being in a shared space. Nothing more. He looked back at his plate. Gordon was explaining zone defense. Adaze was making the right noises. The two sisters were having their own conversation at the far end. The young couple had graduated to quiet laughter. "Do you follow hockey?" the woman across from him asked. It took Lionel a moment to realize she was talking to him. He looked up. She was looking at him directly, not with the slightly desperate brightness of someone trying to be friendly, but with the straightforward curiosity of someone who actually wanted to know. "Not really," he said. "You?" "Enough to know he's been on that defensive theory for 10 minutes, and he's not wrong, he's just very committed to it." Lionel looked at Gordon, who was now using his fork to diagram something on a paper napkin, and felt the unexpected thing happen. A corner of his mouth pulled up before he could stop it. "Lionel," he said, and offered his hand across the table. "Harriet Joyle," she said, and shook it. Her grip was firm, no ceremony to it. "You look like it's your first time here." "Is it that obvious? You ate your green beans first. People who are comfortable save them for last." He looked at his plate. He had in fact eaten all his green beans already. "That's either very observant or you've given it too much thought." "Occupational hazard," she said. "I'm a nurse practitioner. You spend enough years watching people in waiting rooms, you start reading how they sit." He asked where she practiced, and she told him. "A family clinic in Barhaven, been there 12 years, knew most of her patients by their kids' names and their dogs' names, too." She talked about it the way people talk about work they actually chose, not work that happened to them, and there was something in that that made him ask more questions than he'd planned to. She'd moved to Ottawa from Sudbury 8 years ago, following a marriage that had seemed like a good idea in their 30s, and had turned out to be two people who were better as friends than as a couple, which they'd figured out politely and without much drama, and now co-parented a 17-year-old named Felix who was currently at his father's for the week. "That's a good outcome," Lionel said. "Polite and without drama. We both had to work at it," she said. "It didn't start polite. But he's a decent person, and so am I, and Felix needed us to act like it." She picked up her water. "What about you?" he told her. "Not all of it, not the driveway, not the grocery list, not the 2 hours sitting in the dark. But enough, Miri. 6 years. Adaze, who was the one sitting 2 seats to his left, pretending to be very interested in Gordon's napkin diagram, while almost certainly listening to every word. Harriet listened the way she probably listened to patients, fully, without filling the space with reassurances or pivots to her own experience. When he finished, she didn't say, "I'm so sorry," in the way that closed conversations. She just said, 6 years is a long time to carry that. "It gets lighter," he said. "It doesn't go away, but it gets lighter." She nodded. "That's what people who've actually done it say. The ones who haven't say it gets easier, which is different." He hadn't thought about the distinction before, but she was right. Easier implied the thing diminished. Lighter just meant you got stronger. The dinner moved around them. Gordon finished his napkin diagram. The sisters laughed about something at the far end. A Daisy, he noticed, had angled herself slightly away, giving him what passed for privacy at a communal table, which he appreciated more than he'd expected to. Harriet Joyle, he learned, had grown up in a house with 5 brothers and had learned early to take up space in a conversation or have none at all. She read historical fiction and had opinions about it. She'd driven across Newfoundland twice, once in a rental car with Felix when he was 9, and once alone after the divorce, and the second trip had been harder and better at the same time. She had a garden that she was, by her own admission, mediocre at, and a cat named after a Supreme Court justice, which she didn't explain and he didn't ask about. He told her that he'd retired early from engineering. Bridges and overpasses, nothing glamorous, but the kind of work that was either right or it wasn't, and that he spent most of his time now renovating the house that Morel had always said needed more light, which meant he'd been cutting a skylight into the upstairs hallway for 3 weeks and was beginning to suspect he'd underestimated the project. "How bad?" she asked. "There's currently a tarp inside or outside?" Both. She laughed. It was a real laugh, not the performing kind. She laughed the way someone laughs when they've been caught off guard by something actually funny, with their whole face. And then she looked slightly surprised at herself, and then she didn't try to walk it back, which Lionel found he respected enormously. The evening ran long the way evenings do when you stop a-watching the clock. Gordon had moved on from hockey to a detailed account of a road trip he'd taken in 1987. The sisters were exchanging recipes with a woman from the next table. The young couple had gone. The overhead lights, which had felt harsh 2 hours ago, had somehow become ordinary. Harriet checked her phone once, then put it away. Felix doesn't get home until Sunday, she said. Not really to him, mostly to herself. Long week, he said. They all are, lately. She looked at him. That's not a complaint. It's just true. I know the difference, he said. She studied him for a moment, the way she'd been studying him since she sat down, openly and without self-consciousness, the way a person looks at something they're genuinely trying to understand. Then she said, "What made you come tonight?" He thought about saying "my daughter," which was true, or saying I needed to get out of the house, which was also true, or saying I've been sitting in that house cutting a skylight for 3 weeks, and I am losing my grip on the calendar, which was truest of all but felt like more than the moment called for. What he said was, I wasn't ready to be someone who doesn't go to things anymore. It was the most honest thing he'd said in a room full of people since before Morale got sick, and he knew it the moment it came out of his mouth, which is probably why it landed the way it did, not with a thud, not with drama, just with the small specific weight of something that was actually true. Harriet looked at him for a moment longer. That's a good reason, she said. Better than mine. What was yours? Ruth guilt-tripped me at the pharmacy. She's been coming to these dinners for 9 years, and I promised her I'd try it once. She paused. I've been promising for 2 years, so tonight. She turned her water cup in her hands. I'm glad I came for what it's worth. He thought about the parking lot, the sign on the basement door, the way he'd eaten his green beans first. So am I, he said, and meant it. A daisy appeared at his elbow the way children appear when they've been pretending not to listen and have finally given up the performance. I'm going to get dessert, she announced, in the way that meant I'm going to give you 2 more minutes. Use them wisely. She disappeared toward the dessert table. Your daughter's subtle, Harriet said. She gets it from her mother. Harriet smiled at that, the soft kind of smile that knows it's landed somewhere tender and doesn't push. She reached into the pocket of her coat, which was folded over the back of her chair, and found a card, a real one, the small clinic kind with her name and number on it. She set it on the table between them, not handing it to him, just placing it there. The community dinner is every 3rd Saturday, she said. I told Ruth I'd try it once. I didn't say once total. Lionel looked at the card. He thought about the skylight, the tarp. The Sunday afternoons that had started to look exactly like the Saturday afternoons that looked exactly like the Friday evenings. He thought about Mireille, which he always did, not as an obstacle but as a compass. She had been, among other things, a person who believed firmly that the point of surviving something was not to stop doing the things you survived for. He picked up the card. 3rd Saturday, he said. Starts at 6, she said. But if you come at 6:30, the line's shorter. He put the card in his jacket pocket, next to his phone, next to the folded piece of paper where he'd written down the skylight measurements that were apparently incorrect. He'd fix those too. He'd been a bridge engineer for 28 years. He knew how to recalculate. A days came back with 2 plates of apple crisp and set one in front of him without comment, which was its own kind of comment. She looked at the empty space on the table where the card had been, and she looked at her father. And she said nothing, which took more restraint than she usually gave herself credit for. They ate their dessert. Gordon had found a new audience for the 1987 road trip. The sisters were putting on their coats. Ruth was moving between tables with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that the cleanup went better if she started early. When they left, Harriet was still at the table, talking to Ruth, gesturing with her hands the way she did when she was explaining something she cared about. She didn't look up as Lionel and Adeze went past, which felt right. They weren't at the looking up stage, they were at the 3rd Saturday stage, which was slower and more honest, and probably, he thought, more likely to hold. In the parking lot, Adeze linked her arm through his without asking. The November cold had sharpened while they were inside. Their breath came out in small clouds. "You talk to someone," she said. "I talk to people," he said. She looked up at him with the expression he'd been seeing since she was 7 years old, the one that meant "I love you and you are also incorrect." "You talked to a specific person for 2 hours, and she gave you her card. You were watching." "I was sitting 2 feet away, Dad." He didn't say anything to that. They walked to the car. The street was quiet, the neighborhood houses lit yellow in the dark, the kind of Saturday night that was either lonely or peaceful, depending entirely on how you decided to see it. He was deciding. Daisy unlocked the car and they got in and she started the engine and let it warm up the way he'd taught her to, even though the new cars didn't really need it anymore. She'd kept the habit anyway. There were worse things to inherit from your father. "Third Saturday," he said, mostly to himself. "What's third Saturday, the next one?" He looked out the window at the church, the lit basement windows just visible above the snow line. "The community dinner. It runs monthly." Adeze was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful in the way she'd learned from Murray, the way that meant she was feeling more than she was saying. "Are you going to go?" He thought about a woman with gray-streaked hair and a firm handshake and a cat named after a Supreme Court justice, sitting at a folding table under fluorescent lights and laughing with her whole face at a thing she hadn't expected to find funny. "Yes," he said. Daisy put the car in reverse. She didn't say "I told you so," which was its own kind of grace. She'd learned that from her mother, too. The skylight was still unfinished. The tarp was still there, inside and out. There were measurements to recalculate and cuts to redo, and probably, he acknowledged, a second trip to the hardware store he'd been putting off. The house still had corners that were heavy with the particular weight of someone who was no longer in them. But it was getting lighter. He'd said so himself, and he'd meant it, and on the drive home through the Ottawa dark, with his daughter beside him and a business card in his jacket pocket, he found that he still did. Some things you don't find by looking. Some things find you in church basements on third Saturdays, when you finally stop waiting for the bus and sit down.